So New Year's Day, that's kind of cool. And so for our special New Year's message, we're going to finish up Matthew 26. And so this is the part with the cross. And so if we were following like a proper church script, then this is the message that we would do like the week before Easter. But that's not really the way our calendar works. And so we're just going to do it whenever we get to it, and that's today. So it's literally impossible to exaggerate the importance of this event of the cross. And so like this is the moment that history has built up to through thousands of years of Old Testament times. And like in the vast and eternal plan of God, this moment that we're going to be talking about tonight is the fulcrum of all of that. Everything rests on this moment. So history like builds up to this point, and then everything builds out from this point. All right. And so when Paul came to Corinth, he said, "We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles." So like a king who reigns from a cross. All right. It just doesn't make any sense to them. And so one thing is for sure in the ancient world, you never would see people wearing a cross around their neck as a piece of jewelry. All right. So to them, the cross was the ultimate in shame and disgrace. And the idea that the person that you're praying to is a crucifixion victim was just absolutely scandalous to the ancient way of thinking. And so foolishness to Gentiles, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So there's this incredible power in the humiliation and in the humility of Christ's self-sacrifice on the cross. And so today we're going to try and get our heads around why this act, the cross, holds the key to understanding God like nothing else does. And so every single time after this that the scripture tries to make us understand the heart of God, the cross just keeps coming up. Okay, it's an important thing. And so first we're going to get some context for this, and we'll try to realize that the cross wasn't the beginning of the suffering for Jesus. And so just the act of emptying himself of his position in heaven and taking on the limitations of humanity was an astonishing act. All right. So we talked about that towards the beginning of the book of Matthew when we talked about the incarnation. And so he's gone from this like spectacular environment to living in a poor village among oppressed people. And he lived essentially in obscurity. And it would have taken like incredible patience to endure the years of growing up, right? And then like as his life progresses, you see this growing theme of rejection that happens in his ministry. John 6 says that as a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. And so at one time, like thousands and thousands of people were coming out to listen to him. But as he confronts them with the things that they don't want to hear, they kind of fall away. And so he once said that the reason that he wasn't very popular is that he testified to the world that their deeds were evil. And that's just not what people like to hear. John 7:5 says that for not even his brothers were believing in him. His own family thought he was insane. And it's actually not too difficult to imagine where they would get that idea. Jesus says that on the last night of his life, which is where we are now in the story, behold, an hour is coming and has already come for you to be scattered, each to his own home, and to leave me alone. And yet I'm not alone because the Father is with me. So he's saying that he has this one last person that's not going to abandon him, the Father. But that's not going to last either, really. And so we're going to read this. This is where we left off last time after the Last Supper. It says, then Jesus went with them to the olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, sit here while I go over there to pray. He took Peter and Zebedee's two sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. He told them, my soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. So Jesus is like becoming increasingly agitated and upset as this moment of the cross draws closer. And so this is late at night now, and he knows that literally within minutes, he's going to be taken prisoner. And this ordeal is going to sort of begin in earnest. And he asks these guys to keep watch and to stay awake and to pray with him. And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine. So this is a very human moment for Jesus. It's like, isn't there some alternative, right? That's what he's asking here. And one of the things that I think is really difficult for us to understand is the aversion that God has to any kind of evil and sin. And so Jesus is pretty well, at least God is pretty well sickened by evil. And one of the things that Jesus knows is coming is the concentrated sin and the concentrated guilt of all of humanity is like going to flow into him. And he's not looking forward to that at all, really. Luke adds this detail. It says his sweat fell like drops of blood in the garden. And so they say that it is possible for anxiety, extreme anxiety, to produce a condition where you do sweat blood. And so maybe that's really what the case is. At the very least, if it wasn't blood, it fell off his face like drops of blood. So Jesus is pretty upset either way to be sweating like this. Then he returned to the disciples and found them asleep. He said to Peter, couldn't you watch with me even 1 hour? So he had been gone an hour. And there's this like poignant contrast between the agonizing that Jesus is doing during that hour as he tries to steel himself with the courage that he needs to go through with this thing, and the kind of indifference of the disciples who are just basically taking a nap. Okay, and so it's disappointing for him. He says, keep watch and pray so that you will not give in to temptation, for the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. Then Jesus left them a second time and prayed, my Father, if this cup cannot be taken away unless I drink it, your will be done. And when he returned to them again, he found them sleeping, for they couldn't keep their eyes open. So he went to pray a third time, saying the same things again. Then he came to the disciples and said, go ahead and sleep, have your rest. But look, the time has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. So this is the part that we read the last time where Judas comes up and kisses Jesus. Says up, let's be going. My betrayer is here. And I think that it's interesting as we read about all this agonizing that Jesus is doing out here in this garden to, it even says that he's distressed to the point of death. And he's going through some pretty intense anxiety here. And I think we kind of need to wonder what exactly has got him so shaken up. All right. And so one of the things that he could not have been looking forward to is the physical torment of crucifixion. Okay. And he would have a pretty good idea of what this looked like. And he could anticipate what it would be like. So Roman crucifixion is an event that is more violent than anything that any of us have ever seen. All right. In our entire sheltered little lives, we've seen nothing as brutal or as violent as this. And for Jesus, right, there was the flogging that preceded the crucifixion, and that was kind of normal. And this was with like a cat of nine tails with lead tips, okay, or some other hard material, and it would tear into the skin deep, and the blood would flow kind of copiously at this stage. It was pretty common for people to be killed from the whipping alone. And Jesus was whipped this way at least once on this night, and very likely twice. And when the Romans crucified someone, it was designed for shame. And so in our pictures of Jesus on the cross, he has that little loincloth thing that he's always wearing. And the reality is that was not there. Okay, that's put there because we don't really want to see what it really looked like. But they were buck naked. And so we also see pictures of the cross where they're like 20 feet in the air, right? But that's not real either. All right. They don't even have trees that tall anywhere near Israel. Jesus is probably like a foot or two off the ground. He's pretty much right in your face. And so they would put the crosses at prominent crossroads and on highways in and out of town so that people would have to walk right past this. So it was a way of making sure that the people knew exactly who was in charge. It was an act of terror that kept the subject populations from getting any brave ideas. So only slaves and the very worst offenders were crucified. All right, Roman citizens couldn't be crucified except by an explicit ruling by Caesar. And so they would be executed kind of often, but it would be by beheading usually, because this was considered, crucifixion was considered too savage to inflict on a Roman citizen. It was designed to be as cruel as possible. All right, so there are more than a few medical studies of crucifixion out there, and some of them are complete with diagrams and graphic descriptions. And so generally the victim would be spiked to the cross members through their wrists, and their nails that they used were not like our nails. So we have smooth, shiny nails. They had wrought iron nails. They were likely more like railroad spikes than nails. The feet would be laid on top of one another with the knees bent, and a nail would be driven through both feet, so that the way that you would be situated on the cross is that you would have to pull yourself up by the wounds in the hands and your feet in order to clear enough space in your chest to breathe. And so you couldn't really inhale at all without pulling and pushing your way up a little bit. And so, of course, it hurts to pull yourself up on these wounds. And so, muscle spasms from pulling yourself up would force you to let yourself slump down again a little bit, but then you can't breathe. And so it goes on for a long time that way. And the average time of death from crucifixion is 36 hours. Right, but we have records of some victims that lived for 9 days on the cross. Every minute of that in complete agony. And so there's plenty for Jesus to worry about in just the crucifixion part of this. Okay, but eventually, you can't pull yourself up anymore, and you generally die of asphyxiation. If you were lucky, you had like heart failure or traumatic fever that you could die of before that, right? From shock and loss of blood and stuff like that. So Jesus only lasted about 3 hours from when they put him on the cross. That was possibly because of the severity of the beatings that he got beforehand. Plus, he could kind of lay down his life whenever he wanted to. And so his work is done. He lays down his life. And there's also the idea that he kind of had a schedule to keep. Okay, so like if you're into the idea that this was all, deliberately lining up with the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, then he was on a timeline. So the Emperor Titus said that the cross is the most wretched of deaths. In the ancient Egyptian manuscript Pseudo-Manetho, it says that they're punished with limbs outstretched. They see the stake as their fate. They are fastened and nailed to it in the most bitter torment, evil food for birds of prey and grim pickings for dogs. So there's no way they're way up in the air if the dogs are chewing on them. Cicero said that far be it from the lips of any civilized person even to mention the cross in polite conversation. So Tacitus and other Roman authors always refer to crucifixion as the extreme punishment or like the ultimate death. And so they have these euphemisms for it because they won't use the word. That's how gross or vile it was considered. It was profane. Seneca was a Roman politician. He said, I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but many different ways. Some have their victims with head down to the ground. Some impale their private parts. Others stretch out their arms on the gibbet. So the Roman soldiers were given some freedom to vent some sadism here. All right. So they found all kinds of creative ways to torture someone to death with the cross. Pretty brutal. Let's keep reading. Then the people who had arrested Jesus led him to the home of Caiaphas so they could put him to death. But even though they found many who agreed to give false witness, they could not use anyone's testimony. Finally, 2 men came forward. So basically, they weren't getting any testimony that would fit a Roman statute for a capital crime. And so they got these guys to declare, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. And so there was a Roman statute that you couldn't attack any temple in the Roman Empire, punishable by death. And so they had sort of a protection of religious rights. And so that may be the crime here that they landed on for prosecution. Sounds like it a little bit. And so then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself? But Jesus remained silent. Then the high priest said to him, I demand in the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus replied, you have said it, and in the future you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven. So, all right, the answer that Jesus just gave here, it means yes. All right, so that's actually contrary to what some of the creepy commentators say about this, but he said yes. Then the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, blasphemy, why do we need other witnesses? You've all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict? Guilty, they shouted. He deserves to die. Then they began to spit in Jesus' face and beat him with their fists, and some slapped him, jeering, prophesy to us, you Messiah, who hit you that time? So they're like gathered around him. They're beating him up before they take him over to be executed. And the Jewish government wasn't authorized to execute people. So they could imprison people and they could beat them, but not execute them. And so these guys want Jesus dead. And that means that they have to take him to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and convince him to execute Jesus. So we're going to skip the part where Judas throws the money back in. We read that last time. So this is now chapter 27, verse 11. It says, now Jesus was standing before Pilate, the Roman governor. Are you the king of the Jews? The governor asked him. Jesus replied, you have said it. So that's the other charge against Jesus that must have gotten some traction here. And so he's claiming to be king where only Caesar can be king. And so this is certainly the charge that Pilate heard the loudest, as we're going to see in a minute. But saying that you are a king is an act of sedition and revolt against the Roman government. But when the leading priests and the elders made their accusations against him, Jesus remained silent. So he's just standing there. Don't you hear all these charges they're bringing against you? Pilate demanded. But Jesus made no response to any of the charges, much to the governor's surprise. Now, it was the governor's custom each year during the Passover celebration to release one prisoner to the crowd, anyone they wanted. This year, there was a notorious prisoner, a man named Barabbas. And as the crowds gathered before Pilate's house that morning, he asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" He knew very well that the religious leaders had arrested Jesus out of envy. And so Pilate is obviously making a play here to get Jesus released. All right, because Barabbas is supposed to be really bad, and Jesus is like not that big a deal to Pilate. And so it doesn't work. Just then, as Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him this message: "Leave that innocent man alone. I suffered through a terrible nightmare about him last night." So this would carry a little more weight in that day with Pilate and his wife than it would today. And so at this time in history, many people believe that their dreams had some sort of a supernatural or spiritual insight. So the fact that she had this menacing dream and that she saw him as innocent could actually have scared Pilate. Okay. The way that this narrative reads, it seems like Pilate was very reluctant to have Jesus killed. And it certainly wasn't because he believed in him. But he couldn't find any like legal guilt in Jesus, and he was probably a little bit scared of him in a superstitious way, because Jesus is like a holy man. Meanwhile, though, the leading priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas to be released and for Jesus to be put to death. So the governor asked again, "Which of these two do you want me to release to you?" And the crowd shouted back, "Barabbas." Pilate responded, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who's called the Messiah?" And they shouted back, "Crucify him." "Why?" Pilate demanded. "What crime has he committed?" But the mob roared even louder, "Crucify him." Pilate saw that he wasn't getting anywhere and that a riot was developing, so he sent for a bowl of water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours." And so, that's exactly where we get the expression to wash your hands of something, all right, which, we use that to say that we're not responsible for something. But of course, Pilate was responsible, okay? He could wash his hands all he wanted, but there's only one guy around that can make this decision, yes or no, to have Jesus killed. It was Pilate's call, okay? And the pretense here that he's not responsible is garbage. And in fact, Pilate saying that he's not responsible and that he has no guilt is in interesting contrast to the picture that you just saw of the artist Rembrandt painted. All right. So Rembrandt painted this painting, and it's called The Raising of the Cross. It shows people pushing the cross up and into place. And right there at the feet of Jesus, Rembrandt has painted his own face. Okay, so he understands that it was him and his sin that put Jesus on the cross. And so, like Mel Gibson did something similar when he made The Passion of the Christ. It's his hand that's holding the spike that's driven through Jesus's hand and into the cross. All right, so like some people are able to understand their role in what Jesus had to endure. And some people never get it. All right. And Pilate didn't get it. All the people yelled back, "We will take responsibility for his death. we and our children. So Pilate released Barabbas to them. He ordered Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip and then turned him over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. Some of the governor's soldiers took Jesus into their headquarters and called out the entire regiment. And so this is a pretty large group of guys that are kind of planning on having a good time, torturing Jesus. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. They wove thorn branches into a crown and put it on his head, and they placed a reed stick in his right hand as a scepter. Then they knelt before him in mockery and taunted, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spit on him and grabbed the stick and struck him on the head with it, right on the crown of thorns, by the way. And when they finally tired of mocking him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him again. Then they led him away to be crucified. And so there's a little bit of irony here, as there is in a lot of Bible stories. So they're making fun of him for being the king. And he is the king. So any reader of the book of Matthew has known that he was the king since it went through the lineage at the very beginning. Jesus is of the royal line of David. And the angels announced that, like, God sent him to save the world. And so Jesus may not look much like a king, but he is exactly what they are saying he is not. All right, by mocking him this way. Along the way, they came across a man named Simon, who was from Cyrene, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. This is because Jesus kept falling down, all right? He was so weak from the beatings and probably already in shock, he couldn't carry the cross anymore. So they got this other guy to do it. They went out to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. The soldiers gave him wine mixed with bitter gall, but when he had tasted it, he refused to drink it. After they nailed him to the cross, the soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice. Then they sat around and kept guard as he hung there, and a sign was fastened above Jesus' head announcing the charge against him. It read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." So this is what it says on the placard over Jesus' head. "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." And so this sign over the crucifixion victim's head is a fairly normal thing. It even has a name. They called them a certificate of debt. It's a list of your crimes. And it was typical practice to display the certificate of debt along with the execution of the punishment for any given crime. And Jesus's particular certificate of debt we know a little bit more about. John chapter 19 says that Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." Therefore, many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek. So this is right in everyone's face as they go by. A lot of people see this charge. And so the religious leaders give a little bit of a protest. It says, so the chief priests of the Jews were saying to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that he said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" They don't want it to look like he's actually the king. Right? Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." So Pilate is kind of cutting at Jesus here, but he's also taking a shot at the Jews themselves. And so Pilate is known historically as being anti-Semitic. He held them in contempt. He was kind of violent towards them. And now he's been bullied by this Jewish crowd into crucifying Jesus. And so in writing this inscription in this way, he's kind of getting back at them. All right, this is your king, and he's even from Nazareth, right? Like, so he took every shot he could at them in writing this. And so this is obviously a put down on Jesus, but the Jewish leaders would take it as a cut on them also. And it leads to another little irony here. And so according to the official list of Jesus's offenses, he was only guilty of being the king of the Jews, which is no offense at all in his case because it's so completely true. All right, that's the only thing that his certificate of debt ever said. And it turns out that Jesus is not the only one with a certificate of debt. And so the Bible teaches that God has a certificate of debt on every single person on earth. He has a list of every single time that we've fallen short of his holy standard. And so the book of Revelation calls it the book of works. And anyone that comes before God and claims that they deserve to be there is going to be met with the records that have been kept, right? Every thought, every word, every deed that you ever did or failed to do is right there. That's a certificate of debt for you. The Apostle Paul writes a little on this subject in the book of Colossians. He says, he forgave us of all our sins, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us and which was hostile to us. And so, like, mine would be longer than this one on the screen. This must be Paul's that we have up there. But, like, he's imagining this certificate of debt. All right. And he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. And so that's what this is all about. Jesus didn't die for his own sins. His own certificate of debt was basically blank, except for a thing that was true. And so it's our certificate of debt that gets nailed to the cross with Jesus. And so this is the culmination of the entire biblical idea of substitution. It says next that 2 revolutionaries were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. The people passed by, shouting abuse, shaking their heads in mockery. "Look at you now," they yelled at him. "You said you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Well then, if you're the Son of God, save yourself and come down from the cross. So come on, dude, show us how bad you are. You said you could do it." The leading priests, the teachers of religious law, and the elders also mocked Jesus. He saved others, they scoffed, but he can't save himself. So he is the King of Israel, is he? Let him come down from the cross right now, and we will believe him. So there's another little bit of irony there, too. So Jesus could have saved himself. All right, he said that he could summon 12 legions of angels anytime he wanted. He had the power to do that. But if he did that and he saved himself, then he wouldn't have been able to save everyone else. And if he did save himself, then these people, would have believed in him if he saved himself. They're saying that they would believe in him if he saves himself, and they would have if he saved himself, but it wouldn't have done them any good because they'd still be separated from God because he saved himself. All right, and so for Jesus to answer this challenge would result in the eternal condemnation of the people that are challenging him. Kind of cool. So they called out that he trusted God, so let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, "I am the Son of God." Even the revolutionaries who were crucified with him ridiculed him in the same way. Although one of them apparently changes direction. That part is not included in Matthew. At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. So something's happening, right? That's not normal. At about 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you abandoned me?" So Jesus saying this might be pretty disturbing if you think that he's actually asking a question. All right. Jesus said that he was doing all this on purpose and that he knew that it was coming. But this question makes it seem like he's confused or that he's lost his way somehow. And I've heard quite a lot of really bad explanations for Jesus saying this. It's extremely helpful to know that Jesus is quoting scripture here. All right, this is Psalm 22, verse 1. It says, my God, why have you abandoned me? All right, this is a pretty interesting psalm to read in connection with crucifixion. So this is written about 1000 BC, and that is long before crucifixion existed. A form of crucifixion that was really just impaling was used by the Assyrians not too terribly long after this psalm was written, but the Romans didn't think that that was cruel enough, so they adapted it to fit their needs. And so the impaling thing would kill people in like half an hour. And so they were looking for something that stretched on for days, and so they changed it into crucifixion. But look at some of the things that are said in this psalm. My life is poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax melting within me. So his bones are being pulled out of joint. My strength is dried up like sun-baked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You have laid me in the dust of death. And so the intense thirst that Jesus expressed from the cross like echoes this psalm a little bit. My enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. An evil gang closes in on me. They have pierced my hands and feet. No way to mistake that, really. And so that sure never happened to David, who wrote this psalm. I can count all of my bones. My enemies stare at me and gloat. And so you can see that he doesn't have any clothes on. He can look down and count his bones. They divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing. So the scene that's being described in this psalm is the scene that's actually happening to and around Jesus. And by quoting the first line of this psalm, Jesus is calling attention to the fact that this is exactly the plan. And unlike us, these people around Jesus knew the scriptures. All right? They knew this stuff by heart. They sang these psalms every week. And so by directing their attention to this psalm at this moment, it would be perfectly clear that none of this was an accident. This is all prefigured. It's all part of the plan that God has that was unfolding. And so this is all worked out in advance. And so that's why Jesus says this. This is not a question. All right, this is a victory cry. This is the moment that Satan finds out that he didn't stop the Messiah. He fulfilled the Messiah's plan. Some of the bystanders misunderstood and thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah. So it says here, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that's Aramaic. That's the common language that was spoken in the region. But it would have been something that the Romans or any foreigners who were around there wouldn't understand very much of. And so it sounded to them a little bit like he's saying Elijah's name. All right, they misunderstood him. So one of them ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, holding it up to him on a reed stick so that he could drink. But the rest said, "Wait, let's see whether Elijah comes to save him." So they're just oblivious, really, to what's actually going on. Then Jesus shouted out again, and he released his spirit. So Matthew doesn't record what he said, but it is recorded for us. Gospel of John, chapter 19, it says, "Therefore, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, 'It is finished.' And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit." So that's what he said, right there. It is finished. in Greek, this is the single word, tetelestai. So this is the completed perfect tense of like, it is done. And so it's a very interesting thing for Jesus to say right here. So remember earlier, we looked at like a certificate of debt and what that was. And we talked about the fact that everyone has a certificate of debt. And so when prisoners in ancient times were convicted of crimes, the crimes were all put on the certificate of debt. And so if you're going to be crucified, then the certificate of debt would be posted over your cross. If it was a lesser crime that just warranted like a prison sentence, then it would be nailed to your cell door. If you're condemned to like a galley, a rowing galley, then it was nailed to the bench that you rowed from. And if you served a complete sentence, then when you get out, they would take your certificate of debt that listed your crimes, and they would roll it up and they would give it to the prisoner as a sort of like certification that they had served their time. But first, they would write a cancellation across it. And the word that they would use to cancel a certificate of debt was the Greek word tetelestai. All right, so we would stamp a receipt, something like paid in full. Okay, it means that the matter is done. And they would give that canceled certificate to the prisoner to take with them to prove that they had already paid the price for this thing, like whatever they had done, and they couldn't ever be tried for it again. And so it kind of makes you think a little bit the way that all of these threads come together at the crucifixion. And so this last cry from Jesus is one of those things that comes together into something important with a little bit of looking into it. And so at that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split apart. So the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple, and so we kind of know the layout on the inside of the tabernacle temple thing, and so they had an altar where the burnt offerings were offered to God, but then at one end there was like this 10 by 10 cubicle that had a curtain in front of it, or a veil. It's a heavy multi-ply cloth thing, and so inside of that veil was called the Holy of Holies. And so it's like the symbolic dwelling place of God. God's presence is supposedly there. And so, you know, people could come and go outside of the veiled area, but nobody could go inside the veil. That's like forbidden territory. And so the veil itself was the statement that God is different than you. And so we have a tendency to think that we're pretty good and that there's not that much reason for God to have a problem with us. But God is like, you know, wait a minute, you can't just walk into my presence. All right, you're a mess. You can't come in here. And so the only person that could ever go past that veil was the high priest. And even he could only go on 1 day per year. That's the Day of Atonement. And on the Day of Atonement, the priest would like lay his hands on the head of an animal, and he would confer the sins of the people onto that animal. And the sins of the people would symbolically flow into this innocent animal, and then the substitute animal, the animal would be put to death. And so this is similar to the imagery of the Passover, which we have studied before, but that's not what we're talking about right now. So we're talking about the only day that anyone could go into this inner sanctum area behind this veil. That's the Day of Atonement. And when the priest goes in there, he has to have a bowl filled with the blood of the sacrificed animal and like a branch of hyssop or something. And so when he goes in there, there would be like the Ark of the Covenant with the golden angels looking down on it. And he would sprinkle the blood from the animal on the ark, and he would say, a death has occurred. And so, like, we've read about how the blood is reserved, okay, and it can make atonement because it stands for life, and the life is in the blood. And so he would put that blood on the ark, and then he would come back out. And the veil stands there, and it stands for the separation that's between God and humans. And so humans can only get so close to God. But there's always this separation there. All right, Isaiah 59 says, your sins have made a separation between you and your God. And that's the idea that's embodied in this veil in the temple. And so that's the veil that tore in two from top to bottom in this earthquake that's going on here. And so I would think that you can see for yourself what's being said. So the separation that had kept man at arm's length from God is being eradicated. All right, it is finished, paid in full. The sin was the reason for the separation, and the sin is gone. All right, it's paid for, all of it. And so this is a vivid statement of the open accessibility that we have to God beginning at this moment. All right, and so the curtain in the sanctuary torn from top to bottom. Okay, that's not an accident. And so now what John the Baptist said in John 1 makes perfect sense. Okay, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. In 2 Corinthians 5, Paul explains it this way. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. It's like we trade places with Jesus at this moment. Hebrews 10 says that therefore, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, right? And then later it says, let us draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith. And so, unlike the Old Testament people that would have been terrified to enter the Holy of Holies, and for good reason, all right? And so we just get to walk into the presence of God. And so Paul is talking about the intimacy that we can have with God that people never could have imagined before. Intimacy to the point where we can call God Abba, which means daddy. All right, this is the affectionate version of calling him Father. It's not the same as Father. It's Daddy. Well, the Roman officer and the other soldiers at the crucifixion were terrified by the earthquake and all that had happened. They said, this man truly was the Son of God. Well, it's kind of the end of that. But what are we really supposed to get from all of this? All right, so I have a couple of things to suggest. And so as all of these people are like jeering and insulting this blood-covered guy that they are torturing to death, they have no idea that what he's doing for them. And it's the only way that they might get to God. And this was not just for the people that Jesus hung out with and the people who were crying because Jesus was dying. This was also for the ones who were doing the mocking. This death was for everyone. So we read in the book of Romans, chapter 5, it says, very rarely will anyone die for a righteous man, though for a good man, someone might possibly dare to die. And so I suppose if you thought someone was really, really good, you might die to keep them alive. But when we take a look at the love of God, we're looking at something that is orders of magnitude beyond that. God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. All right, this wasn't just for his friends and the good people. this was also for the bad people and his enemies. And it's a good thing, right? Like, because verse 10 goes on to elaborate that it's us who is the enemy. Okay, at the time he died, right? Like, everyone is an enemy. And so that should have some impact on you. These very people that are scoffing at Jesus, right? The soldiers that are beating him and bowing to him as king and making fun of him are the people that he is saving. No, none of them knew it at the time, all right? But it's not surprising that it's many of these same people that came to faith not long after this. And so many of them realized that they had made a mistake. Oscar Wilde is a famous British playwright. He said that self-denial is the shining sore on the leprous body of Christianity. All right, so you may have guessed that he's not a Christian. All right, but it's an interesting sentiment for him to express. Some people are just like repulsed by the whole idea of self-sacrifice. And yet, this is exactly the heart of God. This is exactly opposite of the heart of humanity, which is mostly concerned about what's in it for them. And when we meet God, we're meeting someone that's unlike anyone that you've ever known. He's someone who actually lives for giving of himself to other people out of love. And not one thing pictures this as clearly as the cross of Jesus. All right, this is the ultimate act. And Jesus knew that, he knew exactly what the wrath of God is. He knew exactly what to expect on the cross. And this is exactly what had him so upset that night in the garden. He knew that the sins of humanity would come upon him. And he knew that all of God's contempt for every atrocity and wrongdoing that has ever happened would be poured out on him by the Father. And so this would have been like a huge bolt of like horror and revulsion that only an infinite being would be capable of absorbing. We will never know what this was like for Jesus. We don't even have a category for what this was like. But Jesus knew exactly what would happen. And it's after that that he says, "It is finished." And so apparently the whole thing happened right there while he was on the cross. Okay, done. All right, well, the first question that is left to us is whether you've asked to have your certificate of debt nailed to the cross of Christ. Okay, so this would be a good move. The price has already been paid. It's a good way to start the year. Okay, Jesus would want you to do this. This is exactly why he went through all of this. It was to rescue you from your certificate of debt. But it's not like it's automatic. Okay, you have to ask to have it put on the cross. And if you think you don't really have any need for that, then you're essentially saying that you want to pay for your own certificate of debt. Okay, you're going to pay whatever the price is. Good luck with that. So you need to come forward in faith and trust that your certificate will be put on Jesus' cross if you ask. That's what's meant when people say accepting the death of Christ. So that's how you get rid of the barrier between you and God, and that opens the way for this intimate relationship of love between you and God that lasts forever. And for those of us that may have already done that, we may want to ask ourselves this question. All right. There are moments when, like, the awesomeness of the cross breaks into your consciousness and you can't really believe that God did that for you. But the weird thing is that sometimes it drifts away. Okay, we kind of forget about it. Moves into the background. We start to take the cross for granted. All right, that can happen. It's good for us to think about the cross. We need to think about the cross. It's why he gave us the Last Supper. Okay? We're supposed to do it to remember what he did here on the cross. And so it's very important to us for us and to us as believing Christians to participate in, like, communion, the Last Supper, and to do it as often as we do it, right? That's what he said. I don't know. So, like, maybe we should do communion even more often. I don't know. But we need to find a way to make sure that the cross stays as prominent as we can make it in our thinking. Because there is nothing that is more worthy of your, like, thought, and that changes more about the way that you see the world and see yourself and see God than, like, studying and thinking about the cross of Christ.